Welcome. Be sure to like and subscribe for more scary stories, or I will come for you. Today's stories are more handwritten tales I have personally curated for your listening pleasure. Enjoy. Story number 1. Hey, guys, I need to get this off my chest. I don't even know where to begin. This is one of the most messed up things I've ever experienced in my life. I'm still totally shaken by it and not sure if I'll ever recover. Just a warning, this story is pretty damn graphic and disturbing. It started off pretty mundane, actually. I was just browsing some hacker forums late one night, looking for new exploits and dodgy links like I always do. I'm kind of an amateur cyber explorer, if you want to call it that. Nothing crazy. I mostly just go poking around the dark web and forbidden sites out of curiosity more than anything else. 99% of the time it's all just edgy bullshit and lame attempts to seem hardcore by these script kiddies. But this one link I found stuck out to me. It was posted in a thread about the deep web's most messed up sites. The poster claimed it was a super exclusive Red Room livestream that was incredibly hard to get access to. For those that don't know, Red Rooms are like live-streamed torture shows and snuff films and all that really gnarly stuff. I'd never actually seen a real one before, just heard the rumors. Supposedly, this was the real deal though. An active live stream of some sadistic sickos doing horrific things to an actual person in real time. The post had the ominous message, "Tread carefully. What you see cannot be unseen," along with a scrambled deep web URL. I'll be honest, at first I thought it was all BS. Just a bunch of edgelords trying to seem hardcore and shocking each other. But I was bored, and my curiosity got the better of me. I fired up my secured browser and unscrambled the link, getting past the initial security hurdles with relative ease. After a few more intense security checks, it finally connected to the live stream. The feed was grainy and dimly lit, but I could clearly make out what looked like an abandoned warehouse or factory setting. There was this figure strapped to a metal chair in the middle, slumped over in an awkward position. I figured it was just some sort of bizarre art project or prank at first. But then the screaming started. This horrible, blood-curdling scream that chilled me to my core. The slumped-over figure started convulsing, clearly in immense agony, as a dark, shadowy figure entered the frame. He was wearing one of those creepy sackcloth masks that robbers wear, completely concealing his identity. He was holding some sort of metal instrument that looked like a giant pair of tongs or pliers. As he approached the restrained captive, I could see the tool had a white-hot, glowing end to it, whipping back and forth menacingly. I watched in stunned, sickening horror as the masked man proceeded to clamp the white-hot instrument around the captive's fingers on their left hand, searing the flesh. The screams grew even louder and more anguished as the sadistic torturer slowly burned off each individual finger, one by one. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. My eyes were glued to the screen, my stomach turning over and over as this unspeakable act of brutality played out in front of me. This had to be some sort of sick prank, right? There was no way I was witnessing an actual crime like this in real time. But the screams, oh God, the endless screams, sounded so real and filled with unimaginable torment. Once the fingers were burned to blackened stumps, the masked man moved on, pressing the hot pincers against the victim's face, searing off chunks of skin. The body convulsed wildly, fighting against the restraints as the screams reached a fever pitch. It was too much. I scrambled to exit out of the feed, my whole body trembling and drenched in a cold sweat. But no matter what I did, it wouldn't disconnect. I tried yanking the Ethernet cable, shutting down my computer entirely, doing hard resets. The live stream persisted no matter what. For what felt like an eternity, I was forced to witness the poor soul's unrelenting torture and dismemberment, powerless to shut it off or look away. Each new shriek of agony stabbed through my brain. The masked lunatic burned, cut, and mutilated his captive inch by inch with various sickening tools. I could smell the burning flesh through the screen somehow, taste the terror. Finally, after what seemed like hours, but was probably only 30-40 minutes of absolute depravity, it ended with a final, desperate whimper. The charred and mutilated body slumped forward, clearly dead or unconscious. The masked man stood before the corpse, wiping his blade clean as the feed cut out with a harsh buzz of static. I vomited immediately, my head spinning and thoughts racing. I'd just witnessed an actual murder, a real-life torture, killing right before my eyes. I wanted to call the police, the feds, anyone, but I had no idea where to even begin or who to report it to. The whole thing was utterly maddening. I tried to force it out of my mind, downing an entire bottle of whiskey in a feeble attempt to scrub the horrific scene from my memory. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw those terrified eyes and heard those harrowing, desperate screams echoing in my brain. I didn't sleep a single minute that entire night. The next day, I had to pull it together and go to work, putting on a brave face for my family and coworkers while the previous night's trauma lingered in the back of my mind. I felt like I'd been permanently scarred and damaged, a shell of my former self. It was too much for one person to process. I tried to distract myself, burying my head in mundane tasks and routines, but something about the victim's face and build kept nagging at me for some reason. There was just this strange, uneasy familiarity about them that I couldn't shake. But there was no way. Could it be? Dreading the answer, I pulled up the last few seconds of the static-filled recording from the night before and did my best to digitally enhance and brighten the image in editing software, fighting past the pixelation and shakiness. What I saw next made my blood run ice cold. There was no mistaking it now. The poor, mutilated figure strapped to that chair, burned and dismembered while I'd helplessly watched. It was my best friend, Dave. The sudden realization hit me like a ton of bricks, sparking a brand new level of horror and anguish. No, it couldn't be real. This had to be some kind of cosmic sick joke, right? There was just no way. But the more I peered through the static and graininess, the more obvious it became. That battered, bloodied face, the remaining tufts of his sandy blonde hair, his punk rock tattoos barely peeking through the charred flesh on his arm. It was unmistakably him. Dave and I went way back. We'd known each other since 5th grade at least. I considered him a brother, someone I could always count on to have my back, no matter what crazy situations we got into over the years. He got me through my parents' nasty divorce, even let me crash with him for months when I had nowhere else to go. We were inseparable. Until about 6 months ago, that is. Dave had always been a bit of a loose cannon, dealing with his own inner demons and mental health issues over the years. But he'd managed to keep himself together for the most part, graduating from college, landing a decent job, getting his shit in order, finally. Then about half a year ago, he just fell off the face of the planet entirely. He stopped responding to texts and calls, deleted all his social media, just completely ghosted out of nowhere. None of our mutual friends had heard from him either. I tried reaching out to his family, but they were just as clueless and worried sick about him. After weeks of frantic searching turned up nothing. We all just kind of accepted that Dave needed some space and alone time to work through whatever personal issues he was battling in that head of his. I figured he'd resurface eventually when he was ready. He'd done this a couple times before, where he'd check out for a while to get himself together. I never imagined. God, the thought of what he must have endured in those final moments, trapped and tortured by those sick bastards for reasons I can't even begin to fathom. It's all too much. Even if he was depressed or in a dark place, Dave never deserved to go out like that, to suffer such an agonizing, inhumane fate. Ever since making the grim realization of what I'd witnessed, I haven't been able to eat or sleep. Therapy and medication hasn't helped with the debilitating trauma and PTSD in the slightest. I've had to check myself into a cognitive rehabilitation clinic just to try and keep my shattered mind intact. The police haven't been any help, brushing off my frantic reports as a prank or hoax. With the deep web's bouncing servers and proxy encryptions, they claim there's no way to trace the live stream's origin or identities of the perpetrators. It's maddening, hitting wall after wall as the memory of my best friend's grisly demise haunts me relentlessly day and night. I know this all sounds absolutely insane, like some harrowing tale ripped from a nightmare or horror movie. I can barely believe it all myself most days, but that horrific live stream, as unreal and sadistic as it was, did happen. I witnessed it unfold in real time, watching helplessly as my beloved friend was tortured and killed in the most sickening way imaginable. I don't know why they chose Dave as their next victim, or how he even fell into their vile grasps. But what I do know is that the trauma and guilt will never leave me. His anguished screams as they dismembered him piece by piece, his last desperate whimpers before the light left his eyes. Those haunting sounds are seared into my mind forever. Even talking about it, I can hear them echoing through my fractured psyche. This experience, this exposure to the darkest depths of human cruelty, it's broken me, shattered my spirit, stolen whatever innocence and hope for humanity I had left. Just typing this out has me spiraling back into the pit of despair and hopelessness. I don't know if I'll ever be the same. Maybe one day the raw pain and nightmares will dull, and I can try to rebuild whatever is left of my tattered life. Or maybe this harrowing experience has opened up a wound in my psyche that can never heal, leaving me a permanently damaged and empty shell. All I can do now is trudge on, one agonizing day at a time, and try not to lose what's left of my sanity while coping with the immense survivor's guilt and trauma of witnessing my closest friend's demise. My biggest regret is not being able to save him from such a grim fate, or at least gaining some closure or answers for why he was targeted. Dave didn't deserve to have his life stolen away, to suffer so unimaginably at the cruel hands of those depraved sickos. He was too young, too full of potential and youthful spirit to be extinguished so violently. He deserved so much better than that waking nightmare of an ending. So, yeah, that's my story, I guess. Shocking, unbelievable, traumatizing. I know. Part of me wishes I could simply unsee that entire graphic live leak torture stream, go back to when I was naive and innocent, before my eyes were pried open to the deepest, most twisted pits of darkness in this world. When you see something so unspeakably depraved, like that, up close and personal, it robs you of your humanity in a way. I don't know if I'll ever feel whole again. I just hope, by sharing this deranged tale, maybe someone, somewhere has answers or a solution that can finally bring me and Dave's family some semblance of justice and closure. Or failing that, I hope it at least serves as a stark warning to stay as far away from those terrifying corners of the dark web as humanly possible. Some things, once seen, simply cannot be unseen no matter how hard you try. So, there it is. The most fucked up, harrowing ordeal I've endured in my 28 years on this cruel planet. Believe it or don't believe it, I just had to finally purge those details from my deteriorating psyche after bottling them up for so long. If nothing else, I pray Dave's restless spirit can find some sliver of peace now that his story is out there. As for me, I'm not sure how much longer I can carry on attempting to function as this hollow, traumatized shell, but I'll do my damnedest to keep putting one foot in front of the other, if for no other reason than to keep Dave's memory and spirit alive however I can. Maybe in doing so, I can one day be whole again. Story number 2. My name is Jeff, and I'm just a regular guy living in Seattle. I work construction, and my wife Karen is a nurse. We were living a pretty normal life until our 15-year-old son Tyler got sick last year. It started with him just feeling really tired and run down all the time. At first, we thought he was just being a typical teenager staying up too late playing video games. But then he started getting night sweats and losing weight rapidly. We took him to the doctor, and after some tests, we got the worst news parents could ever get. Tyler had an extremely aggressive form of cancer that had already spread throughout his body. The doctor said the cancer was inoperable and incurable. The chemo might buy him a few more months at best. I remember the exact words the doctor used. Get his affairs in order and make him comfortable. How the hell are you supposed to do that when your son is just a kid? We tried every treatment possible: radiation, multiple rounds of the harshest chemo, experimental drugs through clinical trials. Nothing worked. The cancer kept spreading like wildfire through Tyler's little body. It was absolutely gut-wrenching watching my son deteriorate daily before my eyes. By December, Tyler was basically a skeleton and couldn't get out of bed. His beautiful blonde hair had all fallen out. His eyes were sunken into his skull. He had lesions all over what little skin remained on his bony frame. It looked like he had aged 50 years in the span of 6 months. But through it all, Tyler's mind stayed perfectly intact, and he remained brave and positive. It was like his brain was trapped in this rotting carcass, fully aware of what was happening to him. With modern medicine failing, I became obsessed with finding any kind of solution on the internet to keep my son's mind alive. That's when I first discovered the underground world of head transplants on the dark web. I'll be honest, at first, it sounded like complete insanity. The idea of taking a living person's head and grafting it onto another body seemed like something out of a horror movie. But the more I looked into it, the more I realized there was a small but very real subculture around this. From what I could gather through hidden forums and message boards, there were extremely skilled surgeons in various locations around the world who did illegal head transplants. They helped terminally ill people like Tyler, whose bodies were failing, but whose brains were still perfectly healthy. For the right price, they could perform a head transplant to keep your consciousness intact in a new body donor. Obviously, there were some seriously deranged people into this too, that just wanted to live forever by constantly swapping bodies. But for me, it wasn't about extending my own life. It was about saving my dying son. After weeks of going down one rabbit hole after another on the dark web, I finally found a Russian surgeon based in Seattle who claimed to have done dozens of successful head transplants. His hacker handle was just a series of random letters and numbers, but went by the name Dmitri. From his own admission, he had been expelled from his surgery program in Moscow for doing illicit procedures with the Russian mob's backing. The way he explained it, keeping the brain head and cooling it, was the easy part. The real challenge of a head transplant was fusing the brain stem and spinal cord by reconnecting millions of nerve endings between the head and new donor body. He said he had pioneered new techniques, adapted from experimental nerve graft surgeries to make it work. I provided all of Tyler's medical details and some recent full-body scans he had done at the hospital. Dmitri said we were the perfect candidates since Tyler's brain showed no signs of cancer or damage from treatments like radiation. It was just his body that was riddled with tumors from the neck down. He quoted me $250,000 for everything: finding and prepping a compatible body donor, meds to prevent rejection, and performing the entire head transplant procedure. I just about fell out of my chair at the amount, but then realized I would pay literally any price to save my son's life. Against my wife, Karen's wishes, I emptied our entire life savings, maxed out every credit card, and even took out a second mortgage on our house. I sent Dmitri $100,000 up front via cryptocurrency, with the promise to pay the rest once the procedure was completed. He seemed satisfied and said he already had a compatible donor body lined up. For the next few weeks, he sent me a handful of terrifying videos that made my stomach turn. The first was of a young homeless man who looked completely out of it, on drugs. He was nodding off with drool pouring out of his mouth. Dmitri said this would be the donor body for Tyler's head since my son was so frail. The next video showed the homeless man being brought into Dmitri's makeshift operating room, just a dingy motel room it looked like. He was completely nude and strapped down to a blood-stained mattress in the middle of the room. Dmitri administered some kind of injection into the man's arm. A few seconds later, the donor went completely still, like they had stopped breathing. "Don't worry. That's just a total muscle relaxant to keep him from moving during the procedure," Dmitri's voice said off camera in his thick Russian accent. He then wheeled over this massive ice bath filled with a bluish liquid that looked like antifreeze or something. "Now time to harvest donor before decay," he said plainly. He grabbed a razor from a rusted tray of tools and roughly shaved all the hair off the homeless man's head. After that, he took a bone saw and... oh man, I can't even describe the sound that ensued. The saw was cutting right into the base of his skull, slicing his head clean off like a turkey at Thanksgiving. He just tossed the body aside on the mattress like a sack of potatoes and dropped the bleeding, decapitated head into the freezing blue liquid with a splash. It was the most horrifying, haunting thing I've ever witnessed in my life. But I had to keep reminding myself that this was my son Tyler's only chance at survival now. The next video was even worse. It showed Dmitri going through this step-by-step process of removing the donor's brain from the head and putting it into another small container filled with the same bluish liquid. He used some kind of circular cutting tool to essentially bore through the skull and vacuum out the entire brain matter and stem into a Ziploc bag. It was so gory, I almost puked watching it. The day before the scheduled procedure, Karen and I said our goodbyes to Tyler like it was the last time we'd ever see him. We explained that this special surgery could possibly cure his cancer by giving him an entirely new body. His eyes actually lit up with excitement at the prospect of not being sick anymore. "Mom, Dad, not going to lie. I'll be bummed to lose my good looks," he said with a weak laugh, even as the walking skeleton he had become. "Maybe the new body will be ripped and good at sports." We held each other and cried happy tears, still not really believing this nightmarish plan could work. like a miracle from God. We left Tyler's hospital room with a glimmer of hope for the first time all year. The next morning at 3 a.m., Dimitri texted that he was ready and sent an address in the industrial part of Seattle for a rundown old warehouse. I lied to Karen that a doctor from the clinical trials at the hospital needed me to bring Tyler in for an early treatment, then headed there in my truck alone. As I pulled up, I was surprised to see a fancy-looking black Mercedes S-Class with tinted windows and diplomatic plates parked out front. A large, burly Russian man with a shaved head and neck tattoos opened the door for me as I got out. Without a word, he motioned for me to follow him inside, with Tyler's body in the portable incubator. The warehouse was totally trashed and abandoned, except for a small, curtained-off area with harsh lighting emitting from behind it. There was a foul stench, like rotting meat, wafting outward. More Russian guys dressed like bouncers were standing guard outside, smoking and staring at me menacingly. Anxiety and fear instantly overcame me as I second-guessed this whole plan. "Dad, what is this place?" Tyler asked, weakly in a raspy voice, from the incubator. I told him not to worry and that the doctors just needed to work somewhere private for this experimental procedure. I followed the bald Russian goon through the curtain and had to stifle a gasp. Dimitri was there waiting, already clad in blue surgical garb and reeking of cigarettes. There was a small, collapsible operating table in the center of the room, surrounded by whirring machinery and trays of surgical tools straight out of a torture chamber. Multiple IV stands had bags of fluids, medication, and the same bluish liquid that had contained the donor brain sample. There was also a larger open Dewar container in the corner filled with a thick vapor. 2 more busted, bleeding male bodies laid on the ground near it like rag dolls. "Ah, you made it. I was beginning to think you backed out," Dimitri said with a deranged grin. "Shall we get started? Don't fret over mess is just from previous donors." The burly Russian who let me in opened the incubator and grabbed Tyler's skeletal frame. He began stripping his hospital gown off as Tyler screamed in pain from his lesioned body being moved and touched. His eyes went wide in fear as he sized up the horrific scene surrounding him on the operating table. "Dad, you didn't tell me. What's happening?" he cried out as the tears began streaming down his sunken face. My heart shattered in my chest as I realized I had been deceived and lured into this nightmare. It was too late to turn back now. Through my own tears, I told Tyler to be brave and that this was the only way I could save him. He was going to wake up in a new body that worked after this. "Lies, you sick, twisted piece of shit," I screamed at Dimitri, lunging forward until one of the bouncers smashed me in the chest with a baton to stop me. "Do not insult me, you ignorant fuck. I am greatest surgeon of my generation. Show some respect for saving your son's consciousness. We have no more time. Get him on table or walk away now," he said coldly. I steadied myself as I tried to process this complete and utter hell I'd signed us up for, but looking at Tyler's frail body made the choice clear. I had made a deal with the devil, and there was no going back now. The Russians strapped Tyler down to the table as he wept and begged them not to do this. Dimitri shoved a rag into his mouth to gag him before ramming a long needle filled with drugs straight into Tyler's skull. Within seconds, his pained cries went silent and his body stopped thrashing against the restraints. "Just sedative to numb pain for now," he said dismissively as he strapped a blood pressure cuff around what was left of my son's stick arm. Operating with a sickening level of calmness, Dimitri had one of his henchmen wheel over the smaller Dewar with the bluish vapor billowing out, the realities finally setting in. The pale, hairless head suspended in that liquid must have been the body donor for Tyler. Using a pair of oversized tongs, Dmitri reached in and pulled out the severed head that looked vaguely albino. The neck was a jagged stump of bone and flesh, dangling motorless tendons and veins. He connected the head to tubes and wires that began pumping that chilled liquid through the neck arteries to preserve the freshly cooled brain inside. As you can see, Donor is nearly perfect match for your son. Young, healthy male, with universal blood type and acceptable genetic markers. He explained, like a true madman. We only get few hours before tissue breakdown, so I must do full head removal right away. You may want to look away for this part. With a blank gaze of determination, Dmitri took the serrated bone saw and began cutting away at the base of Tyler's shaved skull. There was no resistance, like a knife gliding through warm butter. The sound was unholy, only dulled slightly by the wet, choking noise coming from Tyler, fighting against the rag in his mouth. I broke down, sobbing, and sank to my knees as I witnessed my dying son's entire head being slowly severed from his shoulders. There was so much blood pouring out, staining the concrete under the table. Dmitri removed the rag so Tyler could get one final breath as his head slumped over, still attached by a dangly flap of muscle and sinew. Head is off cleanly. That is hard part over. I once removed wrong piece. By accident was most embarrassing, Dmitri said as he chuckled at his own sick joke. Now must work quickly before tissue dies. From there, the next few hours were a blur of a full-blown medical nightmare that still haunts me to this day. I somehow found the fortitude to stay in that warehouse and watch as a team of strange men in welders' masks worked to connect Tyler's severed head onto the donor's body, using those tube and wires. They connected his head to some kind of pump system, continually flushing that antifreeze-like fluid through to keep the brain tissue from dying. Meanwhile, Dmitri focused on the incredibly intricate work of preparing the spinal cord stumps for reconnection. He injected both my son's neck and the donor body's neck stem with this blue gel filler he called Neuralink Conductor Matrix. It looked like some sort of conductive paste, maybe copper or platinum nanoparticles mixed into a surgical protein gel. He fused both cord segments together, using a cauterizing micro chainsaw to essentially stitch them together at the molecular level. The other masked members of the surgical team worked to secure the donor body head stub in place over Tyler's shoulders with a horrific contraption of pins, titanium rods, basting threads, and staples. Once the head was secured upright, they did the same at the neck stem junction to allow the tissues time to fuse and heal. All the while, I just knelt in the corner, praying to God they could finish this before Tyler's brain became too damaged by the lack of oxygen and blood flow. My son's disembodied head had glazed over blue eyes and drained of nearly all blood. His mouth hung open in a perpetual silent scream of agony. Pause for consideration, Mr. Martin. Tyler is now permanently attached to new donor body. The final steps carry biggest risk, Dmitri said as he cracked his knuckles from the delicate cord work. If reconnection has mistakes, will be severe brain damage or short life. You still want to proceed for hope of saving? I didn't even hesitate. I told them to do whatever it took to restore blood flow and complete the transplant. Not going through with it after everything Tyler had already been put through would be crueler than death. Dmitri nodded and reached for one last piece of equipment. A strange black headset with dozens of wires and blinking yellow lights protruding out. He lowered it over Tyler's newly reattached head like a menacing metallic crown and flipped some switches. The yellow lights began flashing rapidly as an electrical crackling sound filled the warehouse. It became so deafening I had to cover my ears as the volume grew to a roar of energy like a generator kicking on. For the first time all morning, the sick fucks around me started to look almost nervous as they backed away from the table. Tyler's body jolted straight up off the table, held down only by the clamps and pins encasing his neck and head. His mouth flew open and his eyes rolled backwards until they were completely white. Just when I thought his head was going to explode, I smelled the unmistakable odor of burning flesh and hair fill the air. The roaring energy grew even louder and brighter, until it suddenly released like a shockwave, throwing Dmitri and his henchmen across the room. Everything then went black, as the electricity must have surged and blown all the power. I was left in total darkness of the warehouse, the only sound being the faint humming and flickering of that black headset still locked onto Tyler's head. Panic overtook me before I noticed a subtle red glow start emitting from within Tyler's chest cavity. At first, it was just small flickers, like short little circuits flaring on and off haphazardly. But it quickly grew in intensity until it looked like a raging fire was burning inside his hollow chest and rib cage. The glow illuminated his face, still frozen in that contorted, open-mouth expression with blank white eyeballs staring back. I screamed for help as Dmitri and the others slowly came to from the shockwave. The red light was becoming blinding now, like a vengeful spirit was possessing Tyler's lifeless body. The Russian butchers stood slack-jawed at the sight, too petrified to react. That's when Tyler's fresh corpse sprung up from the table with unnatural speed and grabbed the Russian surgeon by the throat with vice-like strength. His reattached head was jolting wildly as the black headset sparked and whirred with energy. "What have you done to me?" Tyler's voice growled out in a menacing tone far beyond his years. But it didn't even sound fully human. It was like some electronic distortion was warping his words. Dmitri tried to cry out, but could barely wheeze with Tyler's bony fingers crushing his windpipe. The red light in his chest cavity pulsed brighter with each agonizing second. "You tried to play God. Now you'll learn what it's like to be unmade," Tyler roared. Before anyone could intervene, arcs of crimson electricity began shooting out from Tyler's vacant eye sockets and mouth, reducing anything they touched to smoldering ash. The Russian muscle fell first, their bodies dissolving into piles of red goo within seconds from the focused energy beam assaults. Dmitri watched in sheer terror as his surgical team was instantly vaporized all around him by my son's unholy power. He feebly shook his head at me, mouthing something about an override as Tyler's grip tightened. I could only cower in the corner, watching helplessly as the greatest mistake of my life unfolded. Tyler was now some kind of abomination stitched together, his brilliant mind trapped in that undead flesh prison with the weight of a miniature sun burning in his hollowed-out chest. With his final breath, Dmitri locked eyes with me and wheezed out a chilling warning. "Your son is lost, has become machine." On that ominous note, Tyler wrenched Dmitri's head off with a sickening crunch before reducing it to cinders with one concentrated energy pulse. He turned his awake, dead gaze towards me, anger and torment straining against his reanimated features. "Dad, you have to destroy me before it's too late. This power, it's too much," Tyler cried, his voice glitching between his normal self and that sinister electronic tone. Tears were flowing down my face as I shook my head, unable to take any action against him. "This was my greatest sin to bear. I can't, son. I can't do that to you. Not after everything. Just let it take me instead." Tyler's body began to violently shake and contort as the crimson energy built up again like a shockwave, this time emanating outwards from his entire form. Dad, no. Run. You have to run. But his warning was cut off as Tyler's body finally hit some kind of critical limit. There was a nauseating electrical ripping sound as his limbs and torso abruptly disintegrated into a mile-high plume of superheated plasma and radiation that vaporized the entire warehouse around us instantly. I have no idea how I survived that apocalyptic blast, or how I made it out of that forsaken place alive. All I know is that from the moment that blinding light consumed me, a hole has been burnt straight through my soul that can never be filled. My selfish desperation to keep my dying son's consciousness alive at any cost led to his ultimate damnation into becoming an uncontrollable force of destruction. I had no choice but to let Tyler sacrifice himself to save humanity from the technological abomination I had created in a vain effort to perpetuate his existence. Now I am haunted every day by his final words, and that anguished, pleading look in his eyes as they overflowed with power never meant for the human mind to wield. My boy's brilliant light was snuffed out, leaving this world an even darker place than before. So I beg anyone reading this, if you ever face the loss of a loved one, as excruciating as it is, some forces are stronger than we can comprehend. Let them go peacefully when their time comes, lest you suffer the eternal torment of being responsible for disrupting the natural order. The dead should remain at rest. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. This is the Curator. I hope you've enjoyed today's scary stories. Until next time.